So if you've seen any of the other interviews that I've done here at Udacity, you'll notice that I'm now sitting in the other chair. And that's because today we're talking about a topic that was part of my dissertation research, which is exploratory learning environments. So Jason has agreed to give me my questions and interview me on the topic. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything for you, David. I think I've said that before in another video. So what makes exploratory learning environments so powerful in education?
So the reason I really like exploratory learning environments in education is that they let us build circumstances or build situations or build opportunities for students that are pretty hard to have in a real classroom. So in my dissertation research, we did it in the context of middle school ecology and doing scientific inquiry and scientific modeling in that domain. And when you're really doing inquiry in ecology, you're usually doing things that take months or years to gather the data on. And you build models that cover decades of time, or our current climate change models are covering centuries or millennia in time. They get the projections out that far. And our students in a classroom, they have 45 minutes or maybe 2 weeks for a unit. They don't have time to sit around gathering 12 months of data or 24 months of data or anything like that. Mm-hmm. The real power in exploratory learning environments is it lets us take those very real, very authentic opportunities from the real world, take away some of the constraints or the obstacles to using them in the classroom, and strip them down to only those things that are really useful for the learning. So in our research, we had students simulate what would happen to a particular ecological system over a very large time scale under different initial circumstances. So if the system started like this, what would it look like 10 years from now? If it started like this, what would it look like 10 years from now? In person, we can't monitor a system for 10 years for a middle school class project, of course, but we want them to get that experience of what it's like to authentically investigate that problem. And so the real power in exploratory learning environments is to open up those opportunities. But more than just opening up those opportunities as well, the meat of them is also how they give students ownership over that process. So they're called exploratory because the student is exploring. The student is driving what they're doing. The student is going in and saying, I think I want to research this today, or I want to go explore this area, depending on the nature of the environment.
Right.
And so it's not something that we're telling them, you have to do this, and then this, and then this, and here's your assignment, and here's your reading for the day. They get to take charge. And that builds a lot of ownership, a lot of engagement in it, because it's, the experience they're constructing is personal, and it's different for everybody.
Right.
And so that's why I love using them in that, because it teaches students the skills they need to actually survive in their eventual real world. That, when you're on the job, hopefully you don't have someone holding your hand and giving you your to-do list for the day. You might, but hopefully you don't. You're given some free rein and you're trusted to go forward with it. And so exploratory learning environments are a way of opening up those opportunities and those experiences to students earlier in their education.
Mm-hmm. Sounds like it's going to build a lot of confidence for those students.
I hope so, yeah. Actually, in our experiences in that class, it did. We had a couple students who didn't consider themselves very good in science. Right. But it was when they were told, you have the power to question certain accepted truths based on the evidence that you gather, that it kind of gave them this idea that, I don't have to necessarily be a scientist to do research. I mean, you need to become one eventually to do it in the real world. Right. But the idea that beliefs and theories are constructed based on evidence, and you have the power to gather evidence, it's a really powerful idea for students to have that early in their science education.
Absolutely, yeah. When designing a learning environment, what is important to keep in mind?
So for me, the main thing to keep in mind in designing these environments is to preserve the authenticity of whatever problem you're mimicking. And I say that because there's a very strong tendency among some who would design some environments like this to really gamify it. And I have a strong opposition to gamifying just because it creates some nice motivation, but it's motivation that isn't rooted in the material. Right. And so we could have an exploratory learning environment where, for example, you're gathering evidence to explain why certain species went extinct. Mm-hmm. And every time you find a piece of evidence, you get 10 points. And that's not very authentic about it. It's, right. You're basically just looking around, finding clues. What we really want to do when we're creating these exploratory learning environments is preserve the authenticity of whatever activity we're mimicking out in the real world. If scientists use simulations, for example, we want our students to use the same kind of simulations that scientists use. Right. And we want them to derive value from it based on what predictions they can make, not whether or not they achieved an objective or got an achievement or got a trophy or something like that. Right. So I think it's really important to preserve what it is you want to teach in that environment and make sure it's what you want to teach that's actually the motivating part of engaging with that environment.
So you're talking about the focusing on the learning goals as opposed to the gamification of the...
Right, exactly.
All right, very good. We talked a lot about learning environments in the middle school. I'm wondering what sort of application for high school or the collegiate level exists?
So you're right. I think most often we see exploratory learning environments used in lower and middle school. And part of the reason is that they make things very engaging. They're very visually attractive. They're very interactive. They're very, interesting to look at.
Right.
And so that's, I think, one of the reasons why we see them a lot at the earlier ages. But I think they have a very strong place later in life, that the constraints that we deal with at the lower and middle school levels don't go away. When we're in college, we're dealing with the same kind of things of when we're learning about ecology, we're learning about systems, and we're learning about systems that take place over a very long period of time. I think the difference is that the authenticity actually comes out even more strongly when we're doing it later in our college career. So we don't need to dress up as much. We don't need to make it as colorful. We can actually just sometimes give students the tools that real people use. And this is especially, I think, the case in computer science education, that IDEs in many ways are exploratory learning environments. You're exploring the API, you're exploring the different results of different programs and things like that. So I think it definitely has a place later in the educational career. But I think Jason's right, that I think that exploratory learning environments are most often used at the lower and middle school levels. And if you're interested in working with lower or middle school students, or even maybe some high school students, I think it's a really, really nice domain to explore. It lends itself to some really fun projects and some really interesting projects that can really motivate students. But I also encourage you to think about some of the ways we could use the same kind of principles in later education. So thank you for chatting with me about this.
Of course, David.